and RFSL for facilitating this. This has been hours and hours of webinars, so this has been a very good process. So this dimension of development, I think, is simultaneously the most obvious and the most mysterious from a perspective of indicators, because it's obvious that violence and personal safety are problems. It's obvious that this has a direct impact on development, but it's mysterious because it's very difficult to ascertain accurately the level of violence in any particular community or country. Crime statistics collection systems are notoriously flawed, and for LGBT people, we've never really developed a good method of monitoring violence that is satisfactory and gives us an accurate picture of all levels of violence. This task is expensive, it becomes inconsistent, it faces all kinds of barriers. So I think the tendency in terms of discussing indicators is to want to think of new systems and new ways to collect data. And the need for these new systems is very urgent and very important. Millions of dollars are spent creating these systems for crime statistics in general, but for LGBT people, they're almost non-existent. So when we, however, use the indicators to try to create new systems, at least in the short term, what we get is no new system, or at least no new system that's in all countries as we need it, and no indicator. So this particular dimension of development challenges us to try to look at current systems to see how they can be used to collect the kinds of information that we want. So one of the things I think for this call might be to generate ideas about what kind of information we would want, and UNDP staff and others can see how these can be integrated into current systems. The UN conducts surveys of the criminal justice systems and prosecution statistics, etc. And the data collection is also part of national human rights institutions. Ministries of justice collect statistics, etc. So it would be more feasible to take advantage of current systems than to try to create new ones. The other confusion here is what is being measured. Are we measuring violence and threats, or are we measuring safety and protection? And both may be indicators of what we're trying to get at. So I think we should look at both ends. The indicators themselves, and I'm just going to go through them all in one swoop, and I realize that Micah is going to have us walk through them one at a time, but just for sake of efficiency, I'll just do them, all my thoughts now on these. Mm-hmm. For bodily integrity, the concept, I think, of bodily integrity is growing in terms of the understanding that it includes things like non-consensual surgery for sex characteristics. So I think this indicator is a very good one and echoes other priorities and needs of the community. The hate crimes legislation is also one that is a fairly easy indicator to gather. The free speech one is an interesting indicator here. Restrictions on free speech often spur violence, so there's a relationship between the protection of speech and the response to violence. The indicator here is for laws prohibiting free speech about SOGI-esque issues, but there may also be other kinds of things that are already gathered, such as freedom of the press. Maybe we would want to incorporate a freedom of the press score into the indicator calculation. For the next one, violence, and let me say that each of these is really talking about something very different. So these are indicators for one dimension, but these are very different aspects of the same dimension. For violence against LGBTI persons, and let me say as an interjection here, these indicators, and I think my comments yesterday, use the terms LGBTI and SOGIESC somewhat interchangeably. So in this one, the population that we're concerned with is LGBTI people, but the characteristic that can trigger violence are SOGIESC. So we need to probably be a little more precise than the way that I've been speaking. And when we come to the formal articulation of these, make sure that they're articulated along the lines of SOGIESC. But for this one, we're concerned with the population, not the characteristic. So it's going to be very difficult, I think, to get this information in all countries around the world. This essentially requires surveying LGBT people in every country about this issue. And I'm wondering if we could think of other kinds of ways to get indicators for this. Maybe just do surveys in the largest city or the two largest cities, or maybe an indicator is SOGIESC included in statistical reporting systems, or maybe focus on a particular kind of violence, like just murders. Or maybe even violence at particular events like Pride events and Idaho events, public LGBTI events. For LGBTI Asylum, the proposed indicator is there a law recognizing the right to asylum based on SOGIESC. I really like this indicator because I think it's actually an indicator. It's easy to gather, and it indicates whether there's basically a national recognition that violence against LGBTI people is wrong, and LGBTI people should be able to live a life free of violence. So the next one is the justice system. Here the indicator is training. And I've got to say, it would be interesting to hear people's views on this. I don't like this indicator. There's no standard of what constitutes good training. I think that if we just say training, it will be up to countries to say, well, we've had one, and but often we know that trainings are not all that effective. So this indicator to me doesn't really, it's difficult, and it doesn't, I'm not sure what it gets at without being very specific. If we interpret this indicator as whether the topic of LGBTI people or SOGIESC characteristics are included in trainings at all, it would be a much more minimal indicator, but it would be easier to verify. It's more of a yes-no question. And certainly it would still let us know which countries do and which countries don't, so we would be able to make some evaluations using the indicator. We could also, though, look at things like the rate of prosecutions and convictions, which might be easier to gather. Maybe we could have an indicator of whether there are LGBTI people as police officers in the justice system. Or the indicator might also be, as it was above, does the justice system include SOGIESC characteristics in the data collection systems? One thing that we, I think, need to discuss, as Micah said, is the who for each indicator. So one of the basic questions that comes up all the time is, are we talking about identity and expression of characteristics or other definitions? So the example would be for sexual orientation. Are we collecting statistics for MSM and WSW, men have sex with men and women have sex with women? In other words, are we collecting statistics for, say, men who have had a sexual encounter with another male within the past year, let's say? Or are we collecting statistics for men who self-identify as gay, bisexual, or whatever identity is relevant as a sexual minority in that particular culture and country. I would argue that for things like hate crimes, MSM do have an increased level of violence against them, but simply because this is data collection, I think I guess I would prefer the self-identified definition rather than the MSM definition. The other issue is, I think, trans and intersex. If we're going to do data collection, there is a difficulty on terminology for trans, so that's a challenge, but it's certainly relevant and probably the most relevant in terms of the identities that we want to capture. The other question would be with regard to intersex, and it's the same two issues. One is the terms intersex. It's very difficult to, as of today, when these terms aren't familiar to most people, most police departments, most of the people you'd find in data collection systems. And then the second question is, what is the relevance of hate crimes legislation, or what is the relevance of collecting data based on the experience of hate crimes because of sex characteristics? I think the issue of violence against intersex may take a different form and manifest itself in a different way. All right, so that's what I have. So let me turn it back over to Micah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew, for those comments. And I'm sure people will comment on them as we go with the discussion. I will put the slides with the indicators, and I will ask us to go one by one so that we have a bit of a structure. And then when we're done with all of them, we can look at gaps if there are any obvious ones. So let's start with the first one, which is bodily integrity. And I have Susanna first. Please go ahead.
Hi, thanks. You know what, I didn't realize that we were going to go one by one, so my apologies. And I guess the comment I have to make about bodily integrity in some ways covers all of it. And I should also say thank you, Andrew. I generally really agree with the comments that you make. You know, I think that we have a real challenge in these, trying to think about how we measure these and who gets included. And I think it's really important in the context of bodily integrity that we look at what happens around sex characteristics. But I also think that we may want to think about what bodily integrity means for all of LGBTI people, taking to heart the comment Andrew made about, are we talking about identity, or are we talking about behavior? And I guess that is to say, overall, and for those of you who know me, this won't be surprising, I'm really concerned about the fact that most of these look at the whole category of LGBT and I know that there are the tick boxes. I worry about the invisibility of women who have sex with women, because I think, at least in my years of doing this work, there is invisibility over and over and over again. And I have to say, when I see bodily integrity not having some specific reference to women who have sex with women, the reality of family violence, the reality of community violence, and rape for women who have sex with women and trans people, I get very concerned that we're leaving out really important parts of who gets excluded and what gets measured. So, you know, apologies for the kind of using bodily integrity to make a kind of blanket statement. And I guess all of that is to say, if we don't figure out some ways to disaggregate within the categories, we won't be getting information that is really what we need when it comes to translating this exclusion index into the information we need for advocacy, the information that we need for changes in legislation. I'll stop there. As I said, I mean, I actually have some comments to make on other ones of the indicators, but I'll stop there for this one. Thanks.
Perfect. Thanks, Susanna. I think it's, I think it's an important comment and concern that you had here. And I think that was very present from the very start when the index was being formed, how to ensure that no one is actually left from it, and that the groups are still being invisible. So that was very much at the core of how to work the index out. So I think it was great to start that, or to have that comment as we start discussing it. Morgan, please go ahead.
Hello, thank you very much for the webinar. It's been good to listen to where this is up to, and it's also rather early in the morning here, so I'm sorry if I don't make any sense. I'd like. It's not entirely clear to me that this, well, the division between hate crimes and bodily integrity can be perhaps a little grey, because the issues that Susanna has been talking about might qualify as hate crimes rather than a specific issue around bodily integrity. And I'm not quite sure myself of the fit between those two issues. I mean, if bodily integrity is about collecting data on whether or not there is a legal prohibition on unnecessary medical interventions on people born with variations of sex characteristics, then that is very easily countable. And as the details state quite clearly, I mean, it's easily countable and very rare. So it's something that is quite easy to assess. But hate crimes is a much more challenging kind of issue to look at, and that's where potentially there's a lot more scope for nuance. And I can share, I mean, two examples of hate crimes around variations of sex characteristics. I'm not sure if I should do this. The two press reports, one on Nigeria and one on Kenya. I'm not sure if it's okay to share them because they are quite disturbing, and I think that that's one of the issues with this subject. But what I want to get at is that when it comes to intersex, we cannot base a measure on identity or using identity language, because the issues affect infants, children, and people who don't necessarily have the language to comprehend themselves as having an intersex body, but nevertheless suffer discrimination and violence and threats to their safety and bodily integrity because of their physical characteristics. So that's all I want to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Morgan. Just to follow up on this, would you have a suggestion how to rephrase that indicator?
Sorry, no. I mean, I think the bodily integrity indicator is important and probably essential from my point of view. But I think the hate crimes indicator possibly gives a lot more scope to the issues that Susanna was talking about, and also other issues that affect people born with intersex variations and other populations, like anal examinations, for example. I mean, I would qualify that as a hate crime.
Okay, thanks for clarifying. Then I have Laura.
Hi, thanks Micah and Andrew, and for everybody who's spoken already. I had a suggestion on the bodily integrity indicator. I wasn't sure on first reading it whether the very rare meant the number of legal protections or the number of surgeries, or the from what Morgan was saying, it seems that it's referring to the number of legal protections. I was wondering whether it had been considered at any point to include the number of surgeries that are carried out, particularly, this might be particularly useful in countries where there are some existing legal protections that could be used to prevent these surgeries and hormonal interventions, but aren't currently being, but where a sort of casual overview might indicate that there might be protections, but they aren't actually being used. That would be, I think, an additional indicator to the one that's already in there.
Thank you. Raphael? Raphael, we cannot hear you. Oh, okay. Can we come back to you in a second to try again? Raphael has a problem with the microphone. And then if we do that, Vivian is next. Please go ahead.
Solo para confirmar que me escucha, sí.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Listo. Ok. Bueno, yo digamos que estoy un poco como preocupada porque creo que las violencias en los países cambian. Digamos, en Colombia, por ejemplo, el tema de los asesinatos no es tan importante como, por ejemplo, el tema de las amenazas. El tema del conflicto armado nos ha llevado a una dinámica que ha incrementado las amenazas hacia personas LGBTI, sobre todo en las regiones más apartadas de la capital, que es Bogotá. Entonces, no veo, por ejemplo, incluido eso en ninguno de los indicadores de seguridad personal y violencia. Creo que se quedaría muy corto, por ejemplo, entender el tema de la violencia contra personas LGBTI cuando se habla de violencia física solamente, o entender integridad corporal entendiéndola solamente como la normalización de las cirugías. Por ejemplo, en este primer ítem de integridad corporal, yo sí creería que la palabra corporal le quita un poco la importancia al tema. Y no está en ninguna parte de los indicadores reflejado. No sé, creería que el tema de las amenazas pues sería bueno incluirlo en alguno de los indicadores y hablar de violencia simbólica porque, por ejemplo, en Colombia si revisamos las tasas de homicidios a personas LGBTI, no es que sea una cifra tan alarmante como en otros países, pero lo que más alarma en Colombia es el tema de las amenazas. Entonces, y eso, por ejemplo, no se ve tan reflejado allí, solamente como para hablar. Bueno, y en el caso del asilo a personas LGBTI, en Colombia tenemos el caso del desplazamiento interno. No solamente las personas buscan asilo por ser LGBTI en otros países, sino también en otros departamentos, en otras regiones dentro del mismo país. Y eso, por ejemplo, no se ve tan identificado ahí en los indicadores. Solamente eso. Gracias.
The point that I wanted to make is the violence when it comes to murders is not so prevalent in my country, at least, but I don't see the one that is, which is the threats. That is what is very prevalent in Colombia. And this is not seen in any of these indicators. It's not only the bodily integrity, but I think that we are coming short when we're limiting it to bodily integrity. I think it takes away importance to the symbolic violence. In other violence, like there's something that we call here in Colombia corrective violence against lesbian women that started when the guerrilla, at the time of the guerrilla, but it still remains to this day. Also, even though the rates of homicide are not as alarming, the rates of threats are very, very alarming in our country. And this causes, and it ties with the asylum, it ties with that because this is causing displacement of people that are moving within a country, not necessarily to another country, but within the country, they're going to other states in the country where they can be more protected, because this is more prevalent in certain regions that are further away from the capital of the country.
Thank you for those comments. And now I would like also to ask for help with translation. Raphael wrote in a chat because of the microphone issues. Could you help us with that as well? There are two.
Of course. And give me just a little second. Let me. I am concerned about the term LGBTI, because there is some of us that do not identify with the T, and in order to be financed, we are forced to use this term, and it's very, it puts you down for us. It's very demolishing. That's the word that he's using. Mm-hmm. And for the originary populations to be categorized as trans. And regarding surgeries in Mexico, there are problems with some of the surgeons, plastic surgeons, that don't do their job very well. Like when we're talking about phalloplasties, I believe it's called, the boys are not well after the surgery. In one case, one of the boys suffered for 2 years, and he even had to use a diaper in order to come out of his home, and it was due to a medical mistake. And he spent all his money on this, and he had to sell his business. In another case, we know that this person passed away, and we don't even know what was wrong with the surgery.
Thank you. Having heard the comment here on that specific indicator, since we have a bit of a margin when it comes to number of indicators that is proposed now, we could also try to add a new one and look at the bodily integrity in a bit broader way to include other issues that have been mentioned. So that's an option, and it's noted so that we can take on board. Could we move to the hate crimes indicator? There were some comments already about it, but if there are any specific ones on that, please ask to speak. Tamas, please go ahead.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, all is fine.
Okay, we had some problem last time. I think the way the indicator is put is fine, but the way the comment is put as conceptualizing hate crime legislation only as an aggravating circumstance, it's a very specific way of hate crime legislation, and some countries have different ways of conceptualizing it, standalone crimes or qualifying circumstances, etc. So the language should be broad enough to allow for the differences in the actual legal solution in their criminal code. That's it.
Thank you. Shivi, if I pronounce your name correctly. Can you hear us? You are on mute. We can come back. Tina, would you like to take the floor?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Micah. Can you hear me now?
Yes. It's all good.
Okay, thank you. So when it comes to hate crimes and how we measure the situation around hate crimes, I truly believe that only measuring if there is legislation protecting SOGIESC from hate crime is not enough, because that legislation has also to be implemented. So I would add something around that. And also, when it comes to hate crime legislation, I know on the global level, LGBTIQA, whatever, NGOs are advocating for it. But when it comes to trans organizations, we are not that much 100% convinced that is the way to go, because we think what is important, that the perpetrators has to be punished. And for that, we don't need hate crime legislation. So I don't have a concrete idea how we could measure impunity, but that would be the ideal solution, of course. So I'm just raising this concern, and I think just measuring legislation existence is just not enough to get the whole picture. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. And we had, throughout the week, we had a couple of conversations about, measuring if the legislation exists. And many times comments were that, the implementation is actually the key thing, which is the case. But we also need to remember that in some countries, there won't be any legislation to measure, which in practice means that there will be no implementation to measure. So I think just to keep it in mind that also if there is no legislation, it also gives us some indication of what the situation is in a country. So to add a bit of a comment here on what you said, Tina. Who are we having next? Leandro. Please go ahead.
Sí, buenas. Voy a hablar en español. Sí. Primero quería comenzar diciendo, saludando este seminario, que es muy fructífero, de mucho provecho para nosotros. También quiero decir que, bueno, deberíamos comenzar atendiendo dos tipos de indicadores. Uno es el tema de la legislación y otro es cómo se implementa esa legislación. Porque, por ejemplo, en Venezuela tenemos decretos, leyes, acuerdos, resoluciones, pero el tema para aplicarla es el problema, pues el tema de la impunidad. Entonces, eso nos preocupa a nosotros un poco porque no hacemos nada, nos sentimos atados de mano porque ¿cómo hacemos para aplicar estas leyes, estas resoluciones? Por ejemplo, en el caso concreto, hay una resolución del Ministerio de Interior, Justicia y Paz para las personas sexo, género diversa o LGBTI aquí en Venezuela, el cual los policías se le debe dar un trato digno, los policías LGBT, igual que a las personas que van a ser atendidas por los policías. Pero nos preocupa es porque a la hora de aplicar esa resolución para la igualdad y no discriminación es difícil, pues. Entonces, otra cosa que nosotros queríamos plantear es con relación a los centros de retención de las cárceles, pues. Por ejemplo, si una persona intersexual es condenada, ¿a cuál de los reclusorios va a ir? ¿Si al reclusorio de las femeninas o al reclusorio de los masculinos? Igual que nos pasa con el tema de las personas trans, ¿a dónde van allí? ¿Dónde van a ir? O sea, no hay una discriminación. Un compañero me está diciendo que es muy largo la intervención, pero concluyo con esto, con que debemos de buscar solución incluso a la violencia simbólica y a la violencia política. ¿Cómo nosotros podemos tener indicadores para contabilizar esta violencia. Gracias.
Well, I think that we could start with two indicators. One is legislation and the implementation of this legislation. And the problem that we see is that there's a lot of resolutions and a lot of laws that are being passed here in Venezuela, agreements, but the problem is the implementation. How do you measure that? We feel like we're tied because we don't know how to apply these measures, these resolutions, these laws. For example, the Ministry of Peace and Justice here just passed a resolution about dignified treatment of people by LGBTI by police officers, but the application of this is difficult. That is one of the things that we have been finding difficult to do. The other thing is when it comes to jail, to imprisonment of LGBTI, but specifically about trans people, it's difficult also. Where is the trans person going to go? Is it going to be to a male prison or a female prison? So there, I don't think that we have touched on that kind of discrimination. Finally, there needs to be a solution to this symbolic and political violence that we do suffer here in Venezuela.
Thank you so much. We have Queer Youth Council.
For us, we have a concern a little bit. One in one of the countries, like in Africa, let's say example like Kenya, we have a legislation on hate crime, but which doesn't touch at all on LGBTI issue. This is much more on political incitement, tribalism, and much more. So we're looking at how are we going to catch the issue of hate crime in regards to LGBTI issue in a country which LGBTI issue are not even recognized. So how are you going to capture that?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Andrea?
Morning, this is Andrea from El Salvador. I just want to add on the hate crimes that it is important that we could ask for judicialized cases, because I think it's not only important that we have a legislation that includes such as a motive of hate crime, but also what happens if it is implemented. I think it's important to make a follow. And maybe we can ask also for official data on hate crimes, to ask if the state or the entity in charge of the investigations has disaggregated data. Mm-hmm. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Raphael, could we ask for help with the chat box? There is a comment.
Of course. Regarding protection against hate crimes, there is a grave omission regarding infancy and gender infancy variants, trans, etc. They were omitted in the general law of protection of infancy or of children, and this makes homicides. For example, we have the homicide of a 9-year-old child. That's all it says.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Sorry.
Thank you. And Jordan? Jordan, can you hear us? Your mic is on. Maybe there are some problems. And there is another message coming through that some people have problems with their audio today. And it's possible, yes, it's possible to type comments in the chat box, I can read them out, if that's easier. So just to save some time, when people are writing their comments, I would like to move on to the next slide and address the next indicator about free speech, and then we take the comments as they come in the chat so that we don't lose time here. Any comments on free speech and free speech limitations indicator? Susanna, please go ahead.
Hi, sorry, I couldn't get my mute off. Just, you know, I think it's a great indicator, but I'm concerned that I'm concerned that it's going to be really difficult to look at free speech specifically from a SOGS perspective, and you know, and if we can do that, it actually may narrow the meaning of free speech and the kind of space it creates by focusing in too much. So I guess all of which is to say, it's a really important indicator, but I'm not convinced it really belongs here as something that's limited to SOGS issues. That's all.
Okay, thank you. We have a comment. From Jordan in the chat box. I'm going to read it out. I wanted to echo Tamash's comment on broader views of legislation covering hate crime, as well as suggest indicators concerning the capacity of police to recognize indicators of hate crimes in investigation and the number of successful prosecutions under existing laws. Thank you. That is noted, and I think Andrea was bringing up something similar to that. Any other comments on free speech? Tamas, sorry, I didn't see you. Go ahead.
Yes, my comment concerns a probable overlap between this indicator and the one on morality and propaganda legislation in the civic participation package. And I think the delimitation between those two is not so clear. And since we have only a limited number of indicators, I think we should pick one location for it and make it clear that it's taken into consideration there. Do you see which indicator I'm telling?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much. Leandro, please go ahead.
Sí, primeramente quería decir que, bueno, con el tema de la libertad de expresión, hay muchos medios de comunicación que no nos cubren, ni cubren nuestros eventos, nuestras actividades, ¿verdad? Por allí hay una censura por parte de los medios de comunicaciones, quizás no está en la ley, no está algo explícito que no deben cubrirnos, es algo a veces cultural y por eso no nos cubren. Otra cosa es, y cuando muchos nos cubren, no nos cubren de la manera adecuada, quizás no utilizan los términos correctos o lo hacen de manera ofensiva, a veces sin querer. Creo que hay que también formar a los comunicadores sociales, a los periodistas. Y bueno, es eso, totalmente eso. Somos censurados mayormente, por ejemplo, aquí en Venezuela, los medios de comunicaciones ni privados mayormente no nos cubren y tampoco el Estado, los medios oficiales. Es muy difícil que nos cubran, entonces ahí hay que también hacer un indicador hacia los medios de comunicación para que nos cubran.
When we're talking about freedom of speech, it here, for example, in Venezuela, we are not being covered by most of the media, both private and public media. They really are not covering us because of self-imposed censorship, pretty much due to cultural issues. So in the media that does cover us and, you know, our activities and our everything that we do, when they do cover us, they don't cover us correctly. They either speak for us, or sometimes they speak offensively about us, not even by choice. It's more by mistake that they are doing it. So it would be interesting to include this dimension maybe. And how many of the journalists are being trained to cover us, you know, to cover our news.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And then if you could stay on and help us with the comment from Daria. It's in Spanish as well.
Surely. Like the previous one, I believe that this indicator of freedom of speech should not only measure if there is legislation or not, but also its application and manifestations against, you know, when there is, where this freedom of speech is being used.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I can also see that Andrew has a comment. Please go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, I wanted to just comment on the notion of how we're formulating these indicators. The indicators are, the selection of indicators is to select something that can be measured easily and quickly. The indicators really don't describe the entire problem. For the most part, describing the entire problem with these dimensions of development, we want to be free to ask all kinds of questions, quantitative, qualitative, to the government, to NGOs, to everybody, to find out the dynamics of many of these things, like political and symbolic violence, implementation, etc. Indicators really cannot be used to find out new information. It's a bad way to find out new information. It's really figuring out which information already exists that give us a hint of the larger problem. And so it's a way to, without spending all the time and money to do the research that we really need to do, to basically have a shortcut to have an indication. So the question we need to ask for an indicator is to formulate a question that can be answered somewhat objectively, and to think of who's going to answer the question. So if we ask questions like, is a law being implemented? And it's up to the government to respond, well, of course they're going to say it's being implemented. We need to formulate the question that is much more tight and specific and doesn't let the subjectivity of the question, you know, which would permit the government to say what they want, to pick on a UN agency. One indicator for UNAIDS is how many MSMs there are in a particular country. Those indicators are according to statistics that are provided by governments or entities that may not be as accountable as some other things, and the statistics are just simply not reliable. So we need to find indicators where we can just look to a particular kind of problem that we can measure, and maybe experience the frustration of not being able to understand the entire situation. But I just don't think indicators that ask very, very broad questions are going to work.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Andrew, for that. I have two comments in the chat box. One is from Tony. I'm going to read it out. I would like to add that regarding free speech, we need to think about limitations at different scales too. For instance, from the level of a classroom or university to national media legislation or the internet. Limitations can and do apply to all of these different scales, and I think it is important to make the scale issue explicit too when thinking about indicators and measurement. And another comment is from Raphael in Spanish, so I will ask for assistance here.
El siguiente comentario está en español, lo vamos a leer en español. I believe that an indicator that is important is the level of corruption in certain countries, but this is because this is blocking the implementation of human rights.
Thank you. And I am looking also, this is a technical comment, since we have only 25 minutes left, I would really like us to move on to next. We have 3 indicators left, and I'm sure that there will be a lot of comments on that. So let's move on to the asylum indicator. Tamas.
Just a short comment. I think it has to be made clear whether the question concerns legislation or application, and in a different way than before, because I think it is a very general practice in countries to have very broad definition of persecution that could and is often understood to apply LGBTQI people as well, without a direct reference to sexual orientation and gender identity. So decision has to be made whether the question is really the legislation or whether it's applied even without an explicit legislation requiring it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's a great comment, thanks. Andrea?
Just want to add, maybe we can ask also for internal displacement, since in countries in a war and with high rates of social violence, it's very common that we have internal displacement, and that's a type of asylum within the same frontiers in the country. So maybe we can add that as an indicator. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments on asylum? Okay, then let's do the justice system and police training. Here Andrew was predicting a lot of comments, so let's see. Tamas, go ahead.
Indeed, I mean, making this indicator yes or no, it's impossible to do it like that. I think we can come up with more sophisticated measures, but then of course the data collection will be a lot more difficult. I think there are either 2 ways to go into the very sophisticated ways of the percentage of police officers receiving this kind of training, which is one way to go, or the other, go more into legislation or like predefined curriculum for police officers, and whether that includes a reference to the requirement to study about LGBTQI topics. Because simply like giving a yes to a country that once organized an LGBTQI related training for 15 police officers, it's going to be ridiculous, but that's what countries will say.
Yeah, makes sense. Tina?
Thank you. I could only echo what Tamas has already said, and just a side note to that, I think it's not enough when it's justice system, that's not just police. We should also think about prosecutors and judges, and they also should be trained, or somehow it could be measured, because training police is just not enough.
Absolutely. There's one comment from Raphael, but I think it's about asylum, so I will come back to it when we finish this one, not to add too many comments on different topics. Andrea.
Yeah, I totally agree with Tomas and Tina. Just want to add, maybe we can ask if police, prosecutors, or judges, or the institution that rule them, they have a policy to enforce and prevent LGBTI discrimination. That's it.
Thank you. And I think I missed Laura. Sorry about that.
No problem. I agree with what's already been said. And just to go back to the point that Andrew made right at the beginning about possibly also tracking the number of convictions, I would say perhaps an indicator might be number of arrests made by police, either under existing criminalization laws or as part of targeted harassment, because we know that in a lot of countries, arrests are made and then charges aren't made and convictions aren't made, but the arrests are still happening as a form of harassment.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Leandro?
Sí, gracias. Por ejemplo, con relación al tema de la aplicabilidad de las leyes, que es un punto que nos preocupa, como vemos en el comentario anteriores, es, por ejemplo, pero lo podemos medir de la siguiente manera. Cuántas personas LGBTI denunciaron, ¿verdad? Denunciaron X personas LGBTI y esas personas accedieron a la justicia, ¿cuántos fueron resueltos? ¿Cuántos de esos casos de las personas LGBTI fueron resueltos? Allí podríamos hacer un análisis de realmente si se está aplicando la justicia, si hay aplicabilidad de las leyes y si, por ejemplo, en el tema preocupante es en el tema también de los jueces, cómo nosotros podemos ver si hay un juez que es homofóbico, transfóbico, que juzga siempre en contra de las personas LGBTI. Eso también sería una manera de tener un indicador en el acceso a la justicia. Y por último, quería decir con el punto anterior, a los países preguntarle cuántas personas LGBTI fueron asiladas, cuántas personas se le dieron asilo en ese país. Un número, por ejemplo, anual, mensual, que ellos pudieran dar esas cifras. Pues. Gracias.
Very well. Just one second, please. Perfect. When it comes to the application of laws, which is something that is obviously very important for everybody, as we have seen by the comments, the previous comments, measuring, the application of the law may not be as complicated. Maybe we could be asking how many people LGBTI are making charges or pressing charges, how many of those are taken actually to justice, how many of them are accessing justice by having those cases resolved. So that would be an easier way to measure that. The other thing that it would be very, very interesting to know when it comes to judges and trying to figure out if they are trans or homophobic, maybe what we can do is research the results that they are having. How many times are they siding with, the person against the homo or the trans that is placing the charges or that is asking or seeking justice. And finally, it would be not so complicated either to try to find out how many LGBTI persons are being given asylum in countries. We can just ask those countries how many people were seeking and granted asylum, either monthly or bi-yearly or yearly,
Thank you. And now I have 3 comments from Raphael, Daria, and Vivian in Spanish. So if you could stay on with us.
Surely. Training or sensibilization regarding LGBTI should extend to judges, senators, congressmen, and all sorts of bureaucratic levels. that is the comment by Raphael. Daria says, I believe that in this indicator, we should incorporate and evaluate, amongst other things, protection mechanisms that personal or private citizens, the protection of the persons deprived of their liberty as LGBTIs in penitentiaries, and the responses and level of success in the cases that were presented in the judicial system in each country, which, echoes what we just heard. Vivian is talking about the sensibilization in issues like sexual diversity and gender diversity should also go not only to the police, but the army as well, or, the armed forces of countries, etc. And finally, Raphael says, and those programs or systems that are protecting people in homeless situations.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Are there any other comments on the justice system? Queer Youth Council, please go ahead.
For us, we are looking at something totally different. For justice system, we're talking about inclusion aspect of LGBTI. Apart from just looking at the point of training policemen and judges, we're also looking at how do judges use the international convention or human rights convention when they're doing judgment. For example, last year there was this a judge who instructed for an anal test during a case on homosexuality crime. So at what point do judges use the international convention that protects one from such persecution, or what are the protection of an LGBTI person using the international convention or instruments? So we are looking at how best can we measure that. In all the, in most of the cases that pass through courts, do judges reflect back on the international convention that countries in Africa are ratified to? Thank you.
Thank you. And Stephen?
Hi, yes, I don't know if this fits in this indicator, but I just did want to raise the issue of whether we should be also tracking the use of blackmail and extortion based on SOGISEC characteristics as an aggravated circumstance. I do share some of the concerns that have been raised already about whether or not aggravated circumstance legislation is effective, but at the same time, we know that a lot of LGBTI people face blackmail and extortion, and so it would be good to know if those protections exist that view that as a particular crime. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And I would, thanks for all of them, for all the comments. I would like to round up the indicator conversation with the violence indicator, the last one that we have. Some comments were already made as we were speaking about other indicators so far. But if there are any specific comments on this one when it comes to applicability or formulation, Tina, go ahead.
I would like to go back to something that we have discussed at the very beginning, whether we measure based on identity or behavior. And when we are measuring violence, I mean, for the proposed indicator, it's not really possible, because if we are surveying people, most of the people who answer the survey will be identifying as LGBTI. But I think an indicator measuring violence based on gender expression, gender identity, sexual orientation, or I don't have a clear view on other topics, but when it comes to gender identity, I think even if it's named identity, it's not about identity. It's very often, as we see, it's about perceived identity. So in this case, I think it would be really important to measure that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Any other comments? Andrew is writing. Do you want me to read it out?
No, the participants can read it at all.
Okay.
I'm just posting thoughts.
Perfect, thanks. Any other comments from others? If not, that's fine. We can move Queer Youth Council, and then we can move on to the gaps.
As for us, mostly we think that as of the LGBTI community, we usually see what like the other people are giving inside the LGBT, and we don't see the violence amongst ourselves. Like, for example, being in a very physical, violent relationship, but you can talk about it with your friends or the NGOs that are supporting the LGBTI because they feel like it's a non-issue, and if you talk about it, there's not really much to say. You know, we need to start within ourselves, the violence within ourselves before we go out there. That's what I can say.
Thank you for that. Okay, I don't see my chat box moving, so let's see if you identified any gaps in those indicators. Andrea, go ahead.
In the violence incidents, I think maybe we have left out psychological violence and symbolic. I think it is important to acknowledge. And in psychological violence, I will also do a more specific indicator around conversion therapy, if it is allowed by the state of the Ministry of Health, or if it prohibited in that country. For example, in Brazil, we have a backlash last week on conversion therapy. The Supreme Court allowed a psychologist to start doing it. So I think it is important to have in the picture. And also in this last one, I don't know why we are thinking 15 years and older. We are lefting out children's as a specific indicator of violence. And the last one is on someone was saying same-sex partners violence. So we have to start to talk about it. That's it. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you for being so concrete with the examples. So that's super helpful to get those. And now we have two comments in Spanish from Raphael and Daria.
Yeah. Regarding the comment that Andrew makes, it's also necessary to have an indicator regarding violation, sexual violation against men with gender identity that does not conform to the assigned at time of birth. For example, trans or fluid gender, etc. And Daria says, in this indicator, we are concerned about the invisibility that can remain in adult persons, like elderly, LGTB. It could be incorporated, like a sub-indicator regarding specific situations for each population, considering also these kinds of groups, possibly to evaluate the levels of suicide motivated by sexual orientation or gender identity.
Perfect, thank you. So we have throughout the week, we have different approaches and different focus on age. I think that's...
Durante esta semana hemos tenido diferentes acercamientos respecto a la edad, diferentes opiniones.
Yeah, any other comments on gaps? We have 4 minutes, and I would really like Andrew to give his thoughts as well from the whole webinar.
You want me to go now, Micah?
I'm just looking at the chat if there is any action, and if there is none. 1, 2, 3. Okay, go ahead, Andrew.
Okay. Well, I think that these are a lot of very good ideas that have been generated, and I think that there's a lot of possibility that current systems could incorporate them. I wanted to address something that is an overarching issue with all the dimensions of development about the use of the term LGBTI, because I'm assuming, though I think we should state this, that when these indicators are implemented nationally, the term LGBTI would not be used unless it's appropriate for the national community and cultural situation. So in Thailand, we would say Tom and Dee. In India, we would say Hijra. We wouldn't use those terms outside of Thailand or Hijra or India. So that there would have to be some determination about what are the specific identity classifications and terms to be used locally. Now that's my assumption, but I think regardless, we should make sure that UNDP hears that, because if we do use LGBTI everywhere, it's going to result in some things that don't match up and aren't all that appropriate. So that's all that I had.
And to that, I think this is going back to my comment at the beginning, I think, of the webinar, when I said that was, the different language, different lived realities were very much in focus when the index started. So that will be absolutely taken into account. And Raphael had one more question or comment, sorry, in Spanish. It's in the chat box.
In la caja. I believe that also one of the indicators is the implementation of transparency laws and accountability in this regard.
Thank you. Are there any last comments on this webinar? I think we have covered so much and we got so much additional information, super helpful. Andrea wants to make another comment.
I want just to thank you, Mike, and all the team, because all the week you have done an amazing job. So thank you very much. That's it.
Thanks so much. And Raphael is talking about migration, I think.
Yes, about migration.
Okay, perfect.
That's the comment. Yes.
Perfect. And Leandro as well.
Sí, quería decir que bueno, que no tengamos miedo en la aplicabilidad de estos indicadores, que bueno, estamos comenzando. Nadie dijo cuál es el camino por donde debemos andar. El camino se hace al andar. Y bueno, allí vamos viendo los errores, las ventajas y desventajas, y vamos a ir acomodando en el camino. Pues la idea es comenzar y después vemos qué es lo que habrá que arreglar. Y bueno, muy agradecidos con la intérprete y con ustedes que nos están apoyando en esta creación de estos indicadores. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Could we ask for translation?
This is the translator. I'm so sorry. I was on mute.
No problem. It's been a long day.
Yes, Leandro was speaking about not being afraid about the applications of these indicators, and not to be afraid about this process itself. Nobody set the path before. We're pretty much making way as we walk. So there's a lot to learn and a lot to modify as we learn. And thank you so very kindly to all of you who have made this webinar possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those words. Very encouraging. And yeah, exactly. We are making something big. So thank you so much, all of you, for coming today, spending time and sharing your wisdom with us. It's super appreciated, and we will keep you posted how it's going. Thank you to the interpreters for doing amazing job, helping us communicate. Thank you, Andrew, for your thoughts and comments. And yeah, we'll be in touch. Have a great day, evening, morning. Yeah,
thank you, everybody. Thank you, Micah.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thank you.